The gunshot that tore through the stillness of the Wyoming Territory sunset wasn't what frightened Eleanor Zimmerman most, it was the silence that followed. The absence of her husband's voice calling back to assure her all was well told her everything she needed to know. Wyoming Territory, 1878. Eleanor had been hanging laundry behind their modest homestead when the shot rang out. Thomas had only gone to check their cattle grazing on the ridge not a quarter-mile away. They'd been having trouble with rustlers, but Thomas had insisted it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. She dropped the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding against her ribs. When she reached the ridge, the sight that greeted her would haunt her dreams for months to come. Thomas lay motionless on the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. 3 cattle were missing, hoof prints showing where they'd been driven off. The rustlers had made their point. "Thomas!" she screamed, falling to her knees beside him. His eyes, once bright with dreams of their future, stared unseeing at the vast Wyoming sky. Eleanor's trembling hands reached for his face, still warm beneath her touch. "No, please, no." Her grief was a physical thing, crushing her chest until she could barely breathe. But the soft cry from back at the cabin jolted her back to reality. Little Michael, their 6-month-old son, had awakened from his nap. The baby needed her. She couldn't fall apart, not now. The next 2 months passed in a blur of grief and desperation. Without Thomas, the homestead quickly began to fail. Eleanor tried her best, but a woman alone with an infant couldn't manage the cattle, tend the crops, and keep predators at bay. One by one, she sold off most of their cattle just to buy food and supplies, but the money dwindled faster than she anticipated. By late August, Eleanor faced the bitter truth. She had to leave. The homestead that had been their dream was now a place of sorrow and memories too painful to bear. With what little money remained, she purchased passage on the stagecoach heading to Laramie, where her cousin had once mentioned there was work for women in the hotels and restaurants. The morning of their departure, Eleanor packed their few remaining possessions: Thomas's pocket watch, her wedding ring, which she could no longer bear to wear, a small bundle of clothing for Michael, and a faded daguerreotype of the 3 of them, taken just after Michael's birth. Everything else she had to leave behind. The stagecoach was due at noon, but by mid-morning, Eleanor spotted dust on the horizon, riders approaching fast. Fear gripped her heart. She grabbed Michael from his makeshift cradle and ran outside, only to see 5 men on horseback surrounding her cabin. The same men, she was certain, who had killed Thomas and stolen their cattle. "Well, look who's still here," the leader sneered, dismounting. "Thought you'd have cleared out by now, widow woman." Eleanor clutched Michael tighter. "I'm leaving today." "The stagecoach ain't no stagecoach coming," another man cut in. "Road's washed out 10 miles south. Won't be fixed for a week at least." The leader stepped closer. "That's unfortunate for you. See, we've decided this plot of land would make a fine place for our operation. No law out here to bother us." "This is my home," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My husband's claim. Your husband ain't exactly in a position to enforce that claim, is he?" The men laughed, a sound that chilled Eleanor to her bone. "You have until sundown to clear out," the leader said, "or you'll be joining your husband." They rode away, leaving Eleanor standing in the yard, Michael wailing against her shoulder. She had nowhere to go, no horse to ride, and not enough food to last a week until the stagecoach returned. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to cry, tears streaming down her face as she sank to her knees in the dusty yard. Michael's cries grew more insistent. He was hungry, and she had barely enough milk left in her body to feed him. The stress and poor diet had taken their toll. "I'm sorry, my sweet boy," she whispered, holding him close. I don't know what to do. With no other choice, Eleanor packed what she could carry and set out on foot toward the main road. Perhaps she could reach the nearest homestead before nightfall. The Hansons lived about 8 miles east. It was a desperate plan, but staying meant certain death. The August sun beat down mercilessly as Eleanor walked, Michael swaddled against her chest. She'd been walking for what felt like hours, the weight of her pack and the baby growing heavier with each step. Her water was nearly gone, and Michael had been crying intermittently, hungry and uncomfortable in the heat. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor knew she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd overestimated her strength and underestimated the difficulty of the journey. The road stretched endlessly before her, shimmering in the heat. Her legs trembled with each step, and her vision had begun to blur at the edges. When she stumbled for the third time, Eleanor knew she couldn't go much further. She spotted a lone tree about 50 yards off the road and made for it, desperate for shade. Beneath its sparse branches, she collapsed, setting Michael down gently on her shawl. "Just a little rest," she murmured, stroking his flushed cheek. "Then we'll keep going." Michael's cries had become weaker, which frightened Eleanor more than his loud wailing had. She offered him her breast, but she knew there was little milk for him. Her own thirst was overwhelming, but she saved the last few drops of water for the baby, dribbling it carefully into his mouth. "Please, God," she prayed, looking up at the merciless blue sky. "Help us." As if in answer, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Eleanor struggled to her feet, clutching Michael to her chest, and stumbled back toward the road. Either this was salvation or the rustlers had found them. Either way, staying hidden wouldn't save them now. A lone rider appeared through the heat haze, a tall figure on a chestnut horse. Eleanor waved weakly, swaying on her feet. Michael, sensing his mother's movement, began to cry again, a thin, pitiful sound that tore at Eleanor's heart. The rider changed direction, heading straight for them. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out a broad-shouldered man in a worn leather vest, a cowboy's hat pulled low over his eyes. Not one of the rustlers, at least. "Help," she called, her voice cracking. "Please." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing the distance between them in long strides. Up close, she saw a weathered face with kind eyes beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "Madam," he said, taking in her disheveled appearance and the crying infant. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor tried to answer, but the world tilted suddenly. Her knees buckled, and she clutched Michael tighter, terrified of dropping him as darkness crowded the edges of her vision. The cowboy moved faster than she would have thought possible, catching her with one arm while supporting the baby with the other. He eased them both gently to the ground. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice deep and reassuring. "I've got you." Michael's baby cried from hunger in the dust, and the cowboy lifted them into his arms and held them close. "My name's Kieran Xavier," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I'm going to help you, madam, you and your little one." Eleanor tried to speak to thank him, but exhaustion claimed her. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of strong arms around her and her baby, lifting them both as if they weighed nothing at all. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she found herself lying on a bedroll inside a small tent. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was Michael? She sat up too quickly, making her head spin. "Easy there," came a deep voice from outside. "Your boy's right here." The tent flap opened and Kieran ducked inside, Michael cradled in one arm. The baby wasn't crying anymore. Instead, he was sucking contentedly on what looked like a piece of cloth dipped in something. "Sugar water," Kieran explained, seeing her confusion. "Not as good as mother's milk, but it'll keep him going until we can get you both properly fed." Eleanor reached for her son, and Kieran carefully transferred the baby to her arms. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raspy from thirst. "Here," he said, offering a canteen. "Small sips." The water was cool and felt like heaven on her parched throat. Eleanor wanted to gulp it down but followed his instruction, taking small sips. "How long was I?" she asked. "About 3 hours," Kieran replied. "Sun's getting low. I've made camp for the night." Memory flooded back the rustlers, the threat, her desperate flight. "We need to keep moving," she said urgently. "There are men, dangerous men, they'll be looking for us." Kieran's expression hardened. What men? Through parched lips, Eleanor told him everything: Thomas's murder, the rustlers' return, their ultimatum. Kieran listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "Those would be the Blackwood gang," he said when she finished. "They've been causing trouble all through the territory." "You know them?" Eleanor asked. "Of them," Kieran corrected. "I've been tracking them for 2 weeks. Are you a lawman?" Hope flared in Eleanor's chest. A shadow crossed Kieran's face. "No, madam, just a man with a debt to settle." Something in his tone told Eleanor not to press further. Instead, she asked, "Where are we going?" "There's a town called Sweetwater about a day's ride from here. Got a doctor who can look you both over and a decent hotel where you can rest up." "I don't have much money," Eleanor admitted. "Don't worry about that now," Kieran said. "First light we'll head out. For now, you both need rest." He ducked out of the tent, returning moments later with a tin plate. "It's just beans and bacon, but it's hot." The simple food tasted better than anything Eleanor could remember. As she ate, Kieran sat cross-legged at the tent entrance, whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. The rhythmic scrape of blade against wood was oddly comforting. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. "And the little ones?" "I'm Eleanor Zimmerman. This is Michael." She hesitated. "My husband was Thomas." Kieran nodded. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Eleanor, please," she said. The formality of Mrs. Zimmerman felt like a reminder of everything she'd lost. "Eleanor," he repeated, his voice softening on the syllables. "Get some sleep. I'll keep watch." Despite her intention to stay awake, to keep Michael close, exhaustion claimed Eleanor soon after she finished eating. She drifted off to the sound of Kieran's knife against wood and the gentle popping of the campfire outside. Morning came with the scent of coffee and the soft nickering of Kieran's horse. Eleanor emerged from the tent, Michael in her arms, to find Kieran already packed and ready to ride. "There's coffee in that cup," he said, nodding toward a tin mug propped near the remnants of the fire. "And some hardtack. Not much of a breakfast, but it'll hold you until we reach town." Eleanor sipped the strong black coffee gratefully. "How will we travel? I can walk alongside." "No need," Kieran interrupted. "Samson here can carry us all." He patted the chestnut horse's neck. "He's used to heavy loads." After a quick breakfast, Kieran efficiently broke camp, packing everything onto the horse. Then he fashioned a sling for Michael from a spare shirt, showing Eleanor how to secure the baby against her body. "Up you go," he said, helping her mount. Once she was settled, he swung up behind her, one arm reaching around to grip the reins. Eleanor was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, the clean scent of leather and pine that clung to him. They rode in silence for the first hour, the rhythmic sway of the horse almost lulling Eleanor back to sleep. Michael dozed contentedly in his sling, seemingly unbothered by the motion. "May I ask," Eleanor ventured finally, "why you're tracking the Blackwood gang?" Kieran was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "They killed my brother," he said simply. 6 months ago, near Fort Laramie, he was a freight hauler. They wanted his wagon and goods. He refused." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, understanding the grief that edged his words. "Been on their trail ever since," Kieran continued. "Nearly caught up with them twice. They're headed for the Montana Territory, far as I can tell, planning to lose themselves in the mining camps. Is that where we're going? Montana. No, Kieran said firmly. I'm taking you to Sweetwater, getting you and the boy settled somewhere safe. Then I'll continue north. Eleanor fell silent, contemplating the stranger whose quest for justice had intersected with her desperate flight. She ought to feel afraid, alone on the prairie with a man she'd just met, a man bent on revenge. Instead, she felt safer than she had since Thomas died. By midday, the landscape had begun to change, the flat prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with cottonwoods. They stopped briefly by a creek to rest the horse and refill their canteens. While Kieran tended to Samson, Eleanor sat in the shade of a tree, nursing Michael. Her milk had begun to return, likely thanks to the water and food, though it wasn't yet enough to satisfy the hungry baby. We should reach town by sundown, Kieran said, joining her in the shade. He politely kept his eyes averted from her nursing. The doctor there, Jenkins, is a good man. Helped my brother once when he took a bad fall. And after the doctor, Eleanor asked. What then? Kieran studied the horizon. Town's got a decent hotel. The owner, Mrs. Atkins, is always looking for help cooking, cleaning, minding the rooms. She's fair, pays on time. You've thought this through, Eleanor observed. A ghost of a smile touched Kieran's lips. Had a lot of time to think, riding alone these past months. There was something in his voice, a hint of loneliness that resonated with Eleanor's own isolation. She found herself wondering what kind of man he had been before grief and vengeance had set him on this path. What did you do? Before, I mean, she asked. Cowhand, mostly, Kieran replied. Worked cattle drives from Texas up to Kansas, then out to Wyoming. Was saving to buy my own spread someday. He shrugged. Dreams change. Yes, Eleanor said softly, thinking of the homestead she'd abandoned. They do. They reached Sweetwater just as the sun was setting, painting the small frontier town in shades of gold and amber. It wasn't much a main street with a handful of buildings on either side, a church steeple rising above the rest. But to Eleanor, after months of isolation and a day of riding, it looked like salvation. Kieran guided them directly to a small building with a sign proclaiming Dr. A. Jenkins, physician and surgeon. He helped Eleanor dismount, then carefully lifted Michael from the sling. Let me do the talking, he murmured as they approached the door. The doctor, a balding man with spectacles and a kind face, welcomed them immediately despite the late hour. Kieran explained the situation briefly, omitting any mention of the Blackwood gang. Instead, he presented Eleanor as a widow whose homestead had failed, whom he'd found on the road to Laramie. Dr. Jenkins examined both Eleanor and Michael thoroughly, pronouncing the baby somewhat underweight but otherwise healthy. For Eleanor, he prescribed rest, plenty of fluids, and regular meals to help her milk return. The hotel's just down the street, he told them as they prepared to leave. Tell Martha I sent you, she'll find room for you. How much do we owe you, Doc? Kieran asked, reaching for his money pouch. The doctor waved him off. Consider it a welcome to Sweetwater, Mrs. Zimmerman. Just bring the little one back in a week so I can check his progress. Outside, Eleanor turned to Kieran. You didn't have to lie for me. Wasn't a lie exactly, he replied. Just left out the parts that might bring trouble. Small towns talk, and word has a way of traveling. Better if no one knows you're running from the Blackwoods. The hotel was a 2-story building with a wide porch and clean windows. Inside, the lobby was simple but well kept, with a polished wooden counter and a few chairs arranged near a potbelly stove. Martha Atkins was a stout woman with gray, streaked hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took in Eleanor's tired face, the baby in her arms, and Kieran's protective stance beside them. Dr. Jenkins sent us, Kieran explained. Mrs. Zimmerman here needs a room and possibly work if you're hiring. Martha's gaze softened as it rested on Michael. Always need help around here, she said. Room and board plus $2 a week to start if you're willing to cook and clean. That's very generous, Eleanor said, relief washing over her. It wasn't much, but it was a chance to rebuild. Room 3 available, Martha continued, reaching for a key. Up the stairs, first door on the right. She hesitated, glancing between Eleanor and Kieran. Will you be needing 1 room or 2, Mr. Xavier, Kieran supplied, and 2, I'll take whatever you have available. If Martha was surprised or disappointed by this clarification, she didn't show it. Room 5, then, at the end of the hall. $1 a night, includes breakfast. Kieran paid for both rooms, ignoring Eleanor's protests. You can pay me back when you're on your feet, he said quietly as they climbed the stairs. Room 3 was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. Kieran set Eleanor's few possessions on the bed, then stood awkwardly in the doorway. I'll bring up some hot water, he said, and see about getting some food sent up. Thank you, Eleanor said, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt, for everything. Kieran nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he turned to go. Get some rest. I'll check on you in the morning. After he left, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair, Michael dozing in her arms, and looked out at the darkening street below. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something like hope. True to his word, Kieran returned with a bucket of hot water and, shortly after, a tray bearing a bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a pot of tea. He set everything down, then retreated to the doorway again. I'll be next door if you need anything, he said. Lock your door. Eleanor wanted to ask him to stay, to tell her more about himself, about his brother, about anything that would keep at bay the crushing loneliness that threatened to engulf her now that they'd reached relative safety. But she saw the weariness in his face, the way he held himself slightly apart, and she understood he needed solitude as much as she craved company. Good night, Kieran, she said instead, and thank you again. He tipped his hat slightly. Good night, Eleanor. The next morning, Eleanor woke to Michael's hungry cries. The room was filled with soft, early light, and for a moment she was disoriented. Then memory returned, the desperate flight, Kieran's rescue, their arrival in Sweetwater. After nursing Michael, who seemed more satisfied than he had in days, Eleanor washed and dressed in her cleanest remaining clothes. She was brushing her hair when a soft knock came at the door. Kieran stood in the hallway, hat in hand. Mrs. Atkins has breakfast ready downstairs, he said. And I've spoken to her about your situation. She says you can start work tomorrow, give you today to rest up. That's kind of her, Eleanor replied, touched by his thoughtfulness. And you? Will you be leaving today? Something flickered in Kieran's eyes, hesitation, perhaps. Thought I might stay another day or two, he said. Samson could use the rest and I need to restock supplies. Relief washed over Eleanor, though she tried not to show it. Of course, that makes sense. They descended to the dining room, where Martha had set out a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and coffee. As they ate, other hotel guests came and went, a traveling salesman, a young couple clearly just married, an older man who Martha addressed as Judge. Sweetwater's small, Martha explained as she refilled their coffee cups, but we get all sorts passing through. Cattle buyers heading to the ranches, drummers with their wares, folks on their way to the bigger settlements. Eleanor listened, trying to absorb everything about this place that might become her new home. How long have you owned the hotel? She asked. Going on 15 years, Martha replied. My husband built it, but he passed on 10 years back. Influenza. She said it matter-of-factly, but Eleanor recognized the familiar shadow of grief that crossed the older woman's face. I'm sorry, she said softly. Martha nodded. Life goes on, especially out here. Can't afford to stop moving forward. She glanced at Michael, sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms. That little one will keep you going when nothing else can. After breakfast, Kieran excused himself to tend to Samson and purchase supplies. Eleanor, at Martha's insistence, returned to her room to rest. But by mid-afternoon she was restless, unused to idleness after months of constant work on the homestead. She made her way downstairs. Michael swaddled against her chest and found Martha in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. "I'd like to help," Eleanor said. "If you don't mind showing me what needs doing." Martha looked up, flour dusting her forearms. "You're supposed to be resting." "I've rested enough," Eleanor replied, "and I'd rather learn my duties now while it's quiet." A smile spread across Martha's face. "Well then, wash your hands and I'll show you how we do things here." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor worked alongside Martha, learning the rhythms of the hotel kitchen, how many loaves were needed each day, how to stretch the soup when unexpected guests arrived. It was different from cooking in her own home, but not unfamiliar, and the work was satisfying. They were setting bread loaves to rise when Kieran returned, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and leather. He paused in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, looking slightly surprised to find Eleanor there, her sleeves rolled up and flour on her cheek. "Couldn't keep her upstairs," Martha explained, wiping her hands on her apron. "Insisted on learning the kitchen today." "I'm not surprised," Kieran said, his eyes on Eleanor. There was something in his gaze admiration, perhaps, that made her flush slightly. "Did you get your supplies?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Most of them," he replied. "And I spoke to the blacksmith about shoeing Samson. Won't be done until tomorrow afternoon." "Then you'll stay another night," Martha stated rather than asked, already turning to pull more ingredients from the pantry. "Good. We're having beef stew for supper, and I always make too much." That evening, after the other guests had eaten and retired to their rooms, Martha insisted that Eleanor, Kieran, and baby Michael join her at her private table in the corner of the dining room. The older woman produced a bottle of wine for special occasions, and new beginnings qualify, and poured generous glasses for all of them. The conversation flowed easily, Martha sharing stories of Sweetwater's early days, of the characters who'd passed through her hotel over the years. Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time in months, the weight of grief and fear lifting momentarily. Kieran was quieter, but he seemed to relax as the evening progressed, his deep voice occasionally joining the conversation with a dry observation or a question that revealed his natural curiosity about people and places. When Michael began to fuss, Martha immediately offered to hold him while Eleanor ate. The older woman cradled the baby with practiced ease, cooing softly to him. "You're a natural," Eleanor observed. A shadow crossed Martha's face. "Had 2 of my own long ago. Both gone now, one in childbirth, the other to the war." She looked down at Michael, her expression softening. "But life goes on, like I said. New beginnings." Later, as they climbed the stairs to their rooms, Eleanor found herself reluctant to say goodnight. Kieran would be leaving tomorrow, continuing his pursuit of the men who'd killed his brother, the same men who'd murdered Thomas. The thought filled her with a complicated mix of fear for his safety and admiration for his determination. At her door, she turned to face him. "Will you tell me when you catch them?" she asked. "The Blackwoods, I mean." Kieran studied her face in the dim light of the hallway. "Is that what you want to know when it's done?" Eleanor nodded. "They took Thomas from me, from Michael. I need to know when justice is served." "Then yes," he said quietly. "I'll find a way to let you know." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Then Michael stirred against Eleanor's shoulder, breaking the spell. "Good night, Kieran," she said, turning to unlock her door. "Eleanor," he called softly as she stepped inside. When she looked back, his expression was solemn. "Lock your door." She smiled slightly. "I will." The next day passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor officially began her duties at the hotel. Martha proved to be a patient teacher and a fair employer, guiding Eleanor through the daily routines of cleaning rooms, preparing meals, and managing the small laundry room at the back of the building. By afternoon, Eleanor was tired but satisfied with her progress. Martha had shown her to a small room off the kitchen where Michael could nap safely while Eleanor worked, checking on him frequently between tasks. "You're a quick learner," Martha observed as they prepared the evening meal, "and a hard worker. You'll do well here." "Thank you for the opportunity," Eleanor replied. "I was afraid I wouldn't find work with a baby to care for." Martha scoffed. "Babies are part of life. Any employer who can't see that isn't worth working for." She paused, her expression growing serious. "That young man of yours, Kieran." "He's leaving today," Eleanor nodded, ignoring the pang the words caused. "He has. Business to attend to." "Dangerous business, I'd wager," Martha said shrewdly. "I've seen that look before, men with a mission, usually one involving guns." "He has his reasons," Eleanor said, unwilling to betray Kieran's confidence. Martha studied her face. "And feelings for you unless I miss my guess, though he might not recognize them himself yet." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "We barely know each other. He helped me when I needed it, that's all." Martha hummed noncommittally. "Well, time will tell. Now let's get these potatoes peeled before the dinner rush." Kieran didn't appear until late afternoon when Eleanor was changing linens in one of the upstairs rooms. She heard his boots on the stairs and stepped into the hallway just as he reached the top. He looked different, somehow more resolute, his jaw set in a firm line. He'd traded his worn shirt for a newer one, and his gun belt seemed to sit differently on his hips. "You're leaving," she said, the words more statement than question. Kieran nodded. "Samson's ready to ride. Thought I'd head out before sunset, make a few miles before dark." Eleanor twisted the sheet in her hands, searching for the right words. "Please be careful," she finally said. "The Blackwoods, they're dangerous men." "I know," he replied simply. They stood in awkward silence, neither quite meeting the other's eyes. Eleanor was acutely aware that she might never see him again, that he could ride off and be killed by the same men who'd murdered Thomas. And she would never know what had happened to the quiet cowboy who'd saved her and Michael from certain death. "I should get my things," Kieran said, moving toward his room. Eleanor returned to her work, her movements mechanical as she tried to push away thoughts of Kieran riding alone into danger. By the time she'd finished the room and carried the dirty linens downstairs, he was waiting in the lobby, his saddlebags over his shoulder. Martha was at the front desk, tallying accounts in her ledger. She looked up as Eleanor entered. "Ah, there you are. Mr. Xavier was just settling his bill." Kieran turned, his expression softening slightly when he saw Eleanor. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said formally, though his eyes held something warmer. "I was hoping to say goodbye before I left." "Of course," Eleanor replied, setting down the linens. "Is Michael?" "Still sleeping soundly in his basket," Martha assured her. "I checked not 5 minutes ago." Eleanor nodded gratefully, then followed Kieran outside to where Samson waited, freshly shod and laden with supplies. "Martha seems like a good woman," Kieran said as he adjusted the horse's saddle. "You'll be safe here." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Thanks to you." Kieran shook his head. "You'd have found your way. You're stronger than you know, Eleanor." The use of her given name, spoken with such quiet certainty, made something tighten in her chest. "Not strong enough to save Thomas," she said softly. Kieran turned to face her fully. No one could have. The Blackwoods don't leave witnesses, don't show mercy. That you and Michael survived at all is a testament to your courage." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a wooden carving of a horse, no bigger than his palm. "Made this last night," he said, holding it out to her. "For Michael when he's older, so he'll remember." Eleanor took the carving, her fingers brushing against his calloused ones. The little horse was beautifully detailed, with a flowing mane and tail, its head raised as if scenting the wind. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her hand around the carving. "But I want him to remember you, not just the horse." Kieran's eyes met hers, intense and troubled. "I'm not a man worth remembering, Eleanor, not anymore." "I disagree," she said firmly. "You saved us when no one else would. You're a good man, Kieran Xavier, whatever you might think." He looked away, his jaw working as if holding back words. Then, with a fluid movement, he mounted Samson. Looking down at her, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed both a salute and a promise. "Goodbye, Eleanor Zimmerman," he said. "Take care of that boy of yours." "Goodbye, Kieran," she replied, stepping back as he turned the horse. "And God go with you." He rode away without looking back, a solitary figure against the setting sun. Eleanor watched until he disappeared from view, the wooden horse clutched tightly in her hand, before turning back to the hotel that was now her home. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Eleanor worked hard, learning every aspect of running the hotel from Martha, who proved to be not just an employer but a friend and mentor. Michael thrived, growing stronger each day, his cheeks filling out, his curious eyes taking in the world around him. Dr. Jenkins pronounced him in excellent health at his checkup, praising Eleanor's care. "You've done well by him," the doctor said. "Many babies don't fare so well after such a rough start." Eleanor thought often of Kieran during those early weeks, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he'd found the Blackwoods. The wooden horse he'd carved sat on the small shelf in her room, a daily reminder of the quiet cowboy who'd changed their lives. Martha, observant as ever, noticed Eleanor's preoccupation. "No word yet?" she asked one evening as they sat in the kitchen after the dinner service, Michael sleeping peacefully in his basket nearby. "No," Eleanor admitted, "but I didn't really expect any. He's tracking dangerous men through rough country." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Men like that, with vengeance driving them, they either find what they're looking for and make peace with it, or they lose themselves to the hunt." She patted Eleanor's hand. "For his sake, I hope it's the former." "So do I," Eleanor whispered. As September turned to October and the first hints of winter crept into the air, Eleanor found herself settling more comfortably into life in Sweetwater. The hotel guests knew her now, greeted her by name. She'd made acquaintances in town: the baker's wife, the schoolteacher, the young woman who ran the mercantile. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning. Martha had increased her wages after the first month, pleased with Eleanor's work. "You've got a head for business," she told Eleanor. "And away with the guests. They like you." The praise warmed Eleanor, who had begun to think beyond mere survival to building a future for herself and Michael. She'd started setting aside a small portion of her wages each week, dreaming vaguely of someday having a place of her own again, not a remote homestead this time, but perhaps a small house in town. It was late October, with the first snow threatening in the leaden sky, when the stranger arrived at the hotel. Eleanor was at the front desk, reviewing the guest ledger, when the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and a tall man in a worn duster. "Room for the night?" he asked, stamping snow from his boots. "Of course," Eleanor replied, turning the ledger toward him. "If you'll just sign here, it's $1 a night, including breakfast." The man scrawled his name, James Wilson, and pushed the ledger back. "Any hot food available? Been riding since dawn." "The dining room's closed, but I can bring something to your room," Eleanor offered. "We have stew left from dinner and fresh bread." "Much obliged," Wilson said, his eyes lingering on her face a moment too long. Something about the man unsettled Eleanor, though she couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the calculating look in his eyes, or the way he seemed to be assessing her, the hotel, everything around him. She handed him the key to room 4 and watched as he climbed the stairs, his boots leaving wet marks on the polished wood. Only when he disappeared down the hallway did she realize she'd been holding her breath. Shaking off her unease, Eleanor went to the kitchen to prepare a tray for the guest. Martha was there, kneading dough for the next morning's breakfast rolls. "New arrival?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Yes, a Mr. Wilson," Eleanor replied, ladling stew into a bowl. "Something about him seems off." Martha glanced up, her hands not pausing in their rhythmic movement. "How so?" Eleanor shrugged, unable to articulate her feeling. "Just a sense. The way he looked at me, maybe." "Trust that instinct," Martha said firmly. "Women in our position can't afford to ignore it." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll take the tray up. You check on Michael and start the evening lockup." Eleanor started to protest it was her job. After all, but something in Martha's expression stopped her. "All right," she agreed. "Thank you." After checking on Michael, who was sleeping soundly in their room, Eleanor began the nightly routine of securing the hotel, locking the back door, banking the fire in the common room stove, turning down the lamps. She was just finishing when Martha returned, her expression troubled. "I don't like him," the older woman said without preamble. "Asked too many questions about the town, about who stays here, about you specifically." Alarm flared in Eleanor. "Me? Why would he ask about me?" "Said he thought he recognized you from somewhere," Martha replied. "Mentioned he'd been through Wyoming Territory recently." Cold fear washed over Eleanor. "The Blackwoods," she whispered. "What if he's one of them or connected to them?" Martha's expression hardened. "Then he'll find no welcome here." "I've given him his food and told him breakfast is at 7 sharp. The door to the kitchen will be locked tonight, and I suggest you do the same with your room." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. "Should we alert the sheriff?" "On what grounds?" "That he asked questions." "No, we'll keep watch. If he makes any trouble, then we'll involve the law." Martha patted Eleanor's arm reassuringly. "Don't worry. This is my hotel, and I've dealt with unsavory characters before." Despite Martha's confidence, Eleanor slept poorly that night, waking at every small sound, checking repeatedly on Michael in his cradle beside her bed. When dawn finally broke, she was already dressed and ready for the day, Michael fed and content in her arms. She was about to head downstairs when a knock came at her door. Cautiously she called, "Who is it?" "Martha," came the reply. "You can open up." Eleanor unlocked the door to find Martha looking grim. "Wilson's gone," the older woman said without preamble. "Left before dawn. Didn't even take his breakfast." Relief washed over Eleanor. Maybe he had business elsewhere. "Maybe," Martha agreed, though she didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe he found out what he came for." The implication hung in the air between them. If Wilson was connected to the Blackwoods, and if he'd recognized Eleanor, then her presence in Sweetwater was no longer a secret. "What should I do?" Eleanor asked, clutching Michael closer. Martha considered for a moment. "Nothing for now. We don't know for certain who he was or what he wanted. But we'll be vigilant." She straightened her shoulders. "And I'll have a word with Sheriff Parker. Without alarming him unduly, I'll make sure he knows to keep an eye out for strangers asking about you." The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine tasks, though Eleanor found herself jumping at every sound, checking the windows whenever she passed them. By evening, she was exhausted from the constant vigilance, her nerves frayed. "You need rest," Martha told her firmly after dinner. I'll mind the front desk. Take Michael and go to bed early." Too tired to argue, Eleanor complied. She just settled Michael in his cradle and was about to change into her nightgown when another knock came at her door. "Martha," she called, approaching cautiously. "No, madam," came a male voice. "Sheriff Parker, Mrs. Atkins asked me to check in on you." Eleanor opened the door to find a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and kind eyes, a star pinned to his vest. "Evening, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to disturb you." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, relieved to see the lawman. "Please come in." The sheriff stepped just inside the doorway, keeping a respectful distance. "Mrs. Atkins mentioned you might have had some trouble back in Wyoming," he said, getting straight to the point. "And that a guest yesterday might have recognized you." Briefly, Eleanor explained about Thomas's murder, the Blackwood's threats, and her escape with Michael. She omitted Kieran from the story, not ready to share that part of her journey with a stranger, even one with a badge. Sheriff Parker listened attentively, his expression growing grave. "The Blackwoods have a reputation," he said when she'd finished. "They don't usually venture this far east, but if they think you could identify them." He left the implication hanging, but Eleanor understood. The men who'd killed Thomas might come looking for her to eliminate any witness to their crimes. "What should I do?" she asked, the same question she'd posed to Martha earlier. The sheriff considered. "For now, stay put. Sweetwater's small, but we look after our own. I'll alert my deputy, and we'll keep an eye out for strangers matching the descriptions you've given." He paused. "And Mrs. Zimmerman, it might be wise to consider what you'd do if they did find you. Having a plan never hurts." After the sheriff left, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, his words echoing in her mind. A plan. But what plan could she make? A woman alone with an infant against men like the Blackwoods. Her gaze fell on the wooden horse Kieran had carved, sitting on her small shelf. What would he advise if he were here? He'd tracked the Blackwoods across the territory, had studied their movements, their habits. He would know what to do, but Kieran wasn't here. He was somewhere to the north, perhaps in Montana by now, still pursuing his own quest for justice. Eleanor was on her own, as she had been since Thomas died. She had to protect Michael, had to ensure his safety above all else. With sudden resolution, she rose and began to gather her few possessions, packing them neatly into her small bag. If the Blackwoods were coming, she wouldn't wait for them to find her. She'd take Michael and move on, perhaps to Cheyenne or even Denver, somewhere large enough to disappear in. She was still packing when another knock came at her door, more urgent this time. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. It was well past the hour when Martha or the sheriff would call on her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Eleanor, it's me," came a familiar, deep voice. "Kieran." For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it the voice she'd been longing to hear for weeks. Then the knock came again, and she rushed to the door, flinging it open. Kieran stood in the hallway, his clothes travel-worn, his face leaner than she remembered, a new scar cutting across his left cheekbone. But his eyes, when they met hers, held the same steady warmth she remembered. "Kieran," she breathed, hardly believing he was real. "You're here." "May I come in?" he asked, glancing down the empty hallway. "We need to talk." Eleanor stepped aside, closing and locking the door behind him. Kieran moved into the room, his gaze immediately finding Michael in his cradle. A soft expression crossed his face as he looked at the sleeping baby. "He's grown," he observed quietly. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, still trying to process Kieran's sudden appearance. "Kieran, what are you doing here? Did you find the Blackwoods?" Kieran turned to face her, his expression grim. "I found them," he confirmed, "but they slipped away, and now they're coming here, Eleanor. They know you're in Sweetwater." Cold fear washed through her. How could they know? One of their associates, a man named Wilson, has been scouting towns along the eastern edge of the territory, looking for you. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I intercepted him yesterday, about 10 miles north of here. He'd already sent word to the Blackwoods. Wilson was here, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday, he stayed at the hotel. Kieran's expression darkened. Then it's worse than I thought. They'll be coming soon, probably tomorrow or the next day. How many? Eleanor asked, her mind racing. And how do you know their plans? Wilson was persuaded to share what he knew, Kieran said, something hard entering his voice. 3 of them are coming, Josiah Blackwood and his 2 remaining brothers. The other 2 are either dead or have split from the gang. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, trying to absorb this new reality. The sheriff knows about them, she said. Martha told him today after Wilson left. He said they'd keep watch. The sheriff and a deputy against 3 Blackwoods. Kieran shook his head. Those aren't odds I'd bet on. Then what do we do? Eleanor asked, looking up at him. I was packing to leave when you arrived. Kieran's eyes moved to her half-filled bag. That's one option, he acknowledged, but they'd likely follow. The Blackwoods are persistent, especially Josiah. Then we fight, Eleanor said, a fierce protectiveness surging through her. I won't let them threaten Michael again. A slight smile touched Kieran's lips. You have changed, he observed. There's steel in you now. There always was, Eleanor replied. I just didn't know it until I had to. Kieran nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. We fight then, but not alone. He moved to the window, looking out at the darkened street below. I made some allies during my hunt, men who have their own reasons to want the Blackwoods brought to justice. I've sent word to them. When will they come? Tomorrow, if we're lucky, Kieran replied. Until then, we prepare. The hotel is defensible, limited entrances, good visibility from the upper floors. As he spoke, laying out a plan for protecting the hotel and its occupants, Eleanor watched him. There was a new confidence in his movements, a certainty that hadn't been there when they'd first met. Whatever he'd experienced during his months of tracking the Blackwoods had changed him, forged something stronger from his grief and rage. You're different, she said when he paused. Kieran looked at her, his expression softening slightly. So are you. A silence fell between them, filled with all the things they hadn't said about his departure, about the months apart, about the feelings that had begun to take root during their brief time together, and had somehow continued to grow despite the separation. I thought about you, Eleanor admitted quietly, and Michael. Every day, Kieran's gaze held hers. I told myself I was coming back to warn you, he said, that it was about the Blackwoods, about keeping my word to let you know when justice was done. But, Eleanor prompted when he fell silent. But I think I was always coming back to you, he finished, his voice low. Whether the hunt was finished or not. The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Eleanor wanted to go to him, to bridge the physical distance that seemed so small compared to the emotional journey they'd both traveled since their paths first crossed. Before she could move, Michael stirred in his cradle, making the small sounds that preceded waking. The moment shattered, reality reasserting itself. He has good timing, Kieran said, a hint of humor in his voice. Eleanor moved to the cradle, lifting Michael as he began to fuss in earnest. He's hungry, she explained, cradling him against her shoulder. I need to feed him. Kieran nodded, already moving toward the door. I should speak with Mrs. Atkins anyway, explain the situation, and check the hotel's security. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. We'll continue our conversation later. It was both statement and question, his eyes seeking confirmation that what had passed between them wasn't to be forgotten or dismissed. Yes, Eleanor said simply. Later. After Kieran left, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair by the window, nursing Michael and watching the street below. The town was quiet, most windows dark, only the saloon at the far end of the street showing signs of life. Somewhere out there, the Blackwoods were approaching the men who had murdered Thomas, who had threatened her and Michael, who had driven them from their home. Men who thought nothing of killing for profit or convenience. Fear still coursed through her, but it was different now, sharper, more focused. She was afraid not for herself but for Michael, for Martha, for the town that had welcomed them, and for Kieran, who had returned just in time to face danger alongside her. She looked down at Michael, his eyes already drooping as he nursed. "We'll be all right," she whispered to him. "I promise." When Michael had fallen back asleep, Eleanor laid him gently in his cradle and went to find Kieran and Martha. She found them in the hotel's small office, bent over a rough map of the town that Kieran had sketched. Martha looked up as Eleanor entered, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "Kieran's explained everything," she said. "We've sent word to Sheriff Parker, but the town's not equipped for this kind of trouble. My men should arrive by midday tomorrow," Kieran added. 3, possibly 4 of them, all experienced. "And the Blackwoods?" Eleanor asked. "Based on what Wilson told me, they'll likely arrive tomorrow evening or the following morning," Kieran replied. "They prefer to operate at night when there are fewer witnesses." Martha straightened, her decision made. "I'm sending the other guests away first thing tomorrow," she declared. "No sense putting them at risk, and I'll close the hotel, no new arrivals until this is settled." "That's wise," Kieran agreed. "The fewer innocent people involved, the better." Eleanor looked between them, these two people who had become so important to her in such different ways: Martha, who had given her a home and purpose when she needed it most, and Kieran, who had saved her life and then returned to do it again. "I should leave," she said suddenly. "Take Michael and go. This is my fight, not yours." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "The Blackwoods made it my fight when they sent their scout to my hotel. I've worked too hard building this place to let outlaws frighten me away from it. And I've been hunting them too long to stop now," Kieran added. "This ends here, Eleanor, one way or another." His certainty should have frightened her, but instead it steadied her. Kieran wasn't driven solely by vengeance anymore. She could see it in his eyes. He was fighting to protect something now, not just to avenge what had been lost. "All right," she conceded. "But I want to help. I won't just hide while others fight for me." Kieran studied her face, then nodded slowly. "You know how to use a gun, Thomas taught me," Eleanor replied. "I'm not expert, but I can hit what I aim at." "Good," Kieran said, "because when the time comes, we may need every hand that can hold a weapon." The preparations continued late into the night. Kieran moved methodically through the hotel, securing windows, positioning furniture to create barriers, identifying the best vantage points. Martha sent her night porter to alert the sheriff, and then to spread word to her most trusted neighbors about the coming trouble. Eleanor helped where she could, all while checking frequently on Michael. By the time they'd done all they could, it was well past midnight. Martha insisted on taking the first watch, sending Eleanor and Kieran to get some rest. "You'll need your wits about you tomorrow," she said firmly. "I'll wake you if there's any sign of trouble." Reluctantly, Eleanor returned to her room, Kieran walking beside her. At her door they paused, the conversation they'd begun earlier hanging unfinished between them. "You should rest," Kieran said, though he made no move to leave. "So should you," Eleanor replied. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "You could rest here. There's the chair, or we could share the bed." When his eyebrows raised slightly, she hurried on. "Just to sleep. I'd feel safer with you near." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then he nodded, a soft expression crossing his face. "All right." Inside the room, they moved quietly so as not to wake Michael. Eleanor changed behind the privacy screen while Kieran removed his boots and gun belt, setting them within easy reach of the bed. When she emerged in her nightgown, covered with a shawl for modesty, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking somewhat out of place. "I can take the chair," he offered again. "Don't be foolish," Eleanor said, more boldly than she felt. "There's room for both of us." They lay side by side on the narrow bed, not touching but close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from him. It had been so long since she'd shared a bed with anyone, not since Thomas died, and yet this felt different. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something new, something still taking shape between them. "Thank you," she said into the darkness, "for coming back." Kieran was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then his hand found hers on top of the quilt, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I had to," he said simply. They fell asleep like that, hands joined, the quiet rhythm of their breathing synchronizing in the darkness. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through the curtains. Eleanor woke to find Kieran already up and dressed, checking his revolver by the window. Michael was still sleeping, his little chest rising and falling peacefully. "Any sign?" she asked, sitting up. Kieran shook his head. "Quiet so far. Martha's sent the other guests away, and the sheriff's posted his deputy at the end of the street." Eleanor rose and dressed quickly behind the screen, her mind already turning to the day ahead. By the time she emerged, Michael was awake, and Kieran was awkwardly trying to soothe him. "Here," she said, taking the baby. "He's probably hungry." While Eleanor nursed Michael, Kieran outlined his plan. "My men should arrive by noon. Once they're here, we'll position them around the hotel. The Blackwoods will likely scout the town first, so we may have some warning before they make their move." "And if they don't come?" Eleanor asked. "If they decide it's not worth the risk?" "Then we'll have prepared for nothing," Kieran replied, "but I don't think that's likely. Josiah Blackwood doesn't like loose ends, and you're a witness to their crimes." The morning passed in tense anticipation. Martha served a simple breakfast, then busied herself securing the kitchen and storerooms. Eleanor helped, keeping Michael close in his sling. The baby seemed to sense the tension, fussing more than usual. Just before noon, as Kieran had predicted, riders approached the hotel, 3 men on dust-covered horses. But they weren't the Blackwoods. Kieran met them outside, and Eleanor watched from the window as he greeted them with the easy familiarity of men who had ridden together. When they entered the hotel, Kieran introduced them to Eleanor and Martha. "Jack Miller, former Army scout," he said, indicating a lean, weathered man with graying hair. "Sam Tanner, best shot I've ever seen. And Nate Foster, who knows more about tracking outlaws than any man alive." The men nodded respectfully to the women. They had the hard, capable look of men who had seen their share of trouble and survived it. "Kieran says you've had dealings with the Blackwoods," Jack said to Eleanor, his tone matter of fact. "Sorry for your loss, madam." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, appreciating the simple acknowledgement. "And thank you for coming. The Blackwoods have hurt plenty of folks," Sam said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a tough-looking man. About time someone put an end to their meandering. With the arrival of Kieran's allies, the preparations took on a new urgency. The men positioned themselves strategically, Jack on the hotel roof, Sam in the upstairs hallway with its view of the main street, Nate at the back of the building. Kieran moved between positions, checking and double-checking their defenses. Sheriff Parker arrived mid-afternoon, his expression grim. "Got word from a ranch to the south," he reported. 3 riders passed through early this morning asking directions to Sweetwater. Matches the descriptions you gave. They'll be here by nightfall," Kieran concluded. "Sheriff, Your place is protecting the town. If shooting starts, keep your people indoors and away from windows." Parker nodded, looking relieved to have someone taking charge. "I've already spread the word. The saloon's closed and most folks are staying home." He glanced at Eleanor, who stood nearby with Michael. "Mrs. Zimmerman, are you sure you wouldn't be safer at my office? My wife could look after you and the little one." Before Eleanor could respond, Kieran answered for her. "She stays here. The hotel's more defensible and we have the numbers." The sheriff looked like he might argue, then thought better of it. "All right. I'll keep my deputy posted at the south end of town. First sign of trouble, we'll come running." As the day waned, tension built within the hotel. Martha prepared a simple dinner, which they ate in shifts, maintaining their watch positions. Michael, sensing the unease around him, became increasingly fretful. Nothing Eleanor did seemed to soothe him. "Let me try," Kieran said unexpectedly as evening approached. He held out his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor transferred the crying baby to him. To her surprise, Kieran handled Michael with unexpected gentleness, cradling him against his chest and pacing slowly around the room, humming a tune Eleanor didn't recognize. Gradually, Michael's cries subsided and he blinked up at Kieran with curious eyes. "My brother had children," Kieran explained, seeing Eleanor's surprise. "I used to help with them when I visited." "You never mentioned that," Eleanor said softly. "A lot of things I never mentioned," Kieran replied, his eyes meeting hers over Michael's head. "Things I should have said before I left." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, Jack called from upstairs. Riders approaching from the south, 3 of them moving slow. The moment had passed. Kieran carefully handed Michael back to Eleanor. "Take him to your room," he instructed, all softness gone from his voice. "Stay there until I come for you." Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist on helping, but one look at Michael's face convinced her otherwise. Her first duty was to protect her son. She nodded and hurried upstairs, Martha following close behind. "I'll stay with you," the older woman said, a loaded shotgun in her hands. "2 sets of eyes are better than 1. In her room, Eleanor placed Michael in his cradle, then took up position by the window, careful to stay to one side where she wouldn't be visible from the street. Martha stood by the door, her shotgun ready. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see the 3 riders approaching slowly down the main street. They were rough-looking men, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. They stopped in front of the hotel, studying the building with calculating eyes. "That'll be them," Martha murmured. "The Blackwoods." Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched the men dismount and tie their horses to the hitching post. The tallest of the 3, Josiah, she presumed spoke to the others, gesturing toward the hotel. One of them laughed, a sound that carried clearly through the evening air. They were confident, Eleanor realized. They expected to find a lone woman, easily intimidated or eliminated. They had no idea what awaited them inside. The front door of the hotel opened, and Kieran stepped out onto the porch, his stance casual but his hand near his gun. Even from her position upstairs, Eleanor could feel the tension emanating from him. "Evening, gentlemen," his voice carried clearly. "Hotels closed for the night." The 3 men froze, clearly surprised to find someone confronting them so directly. Josiah recovered first, stepping forward. "We're not looking for rooms," he said, his voice carrying a hint of a southern drawl. "We're looking for a woman. Eleanor Zimmerman. Heard she might be staying here." "Don't know anyone by that name," Kieran replied evenly. "Like I said, hotels closed." The Blackwoods exchanged glances. "That's mighty unfriendly," Josiah said, his hand drifting toward his gun. "Especially since we've come such a long way to see her." "I suggest you boys move on," Kieran said, his voice hardening. "There's nothing for you here." One of the younger Blackwoods spat in the dirt. "We know she's here. Wilson told us before he met with that unfortunate accident." "Did he now?" Kieran's voice remained even, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Well, Wilson was mistaken, and if I were you, I'd leave town before you meet with an unfortunate accident of your own." For a long moment the men stared at each other, the air between them charged with potential violence. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, Josiah laughed. "All right, mister," he said, taking a step back. "We'll go, for now, but we'll be back with more men." The three Blackwoods untied their horses and mounted, turning to ride away. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Had it really been that easy? Then, in a movement so swift she almost missed it, the youngest Blackwood wheeled his horse around, drawing his gun in the same motion. A shot rang out and Eleanor gasped, expecting to see Kieran fall. Instead, it was the young Blackwood who tumbled from his saddle, a look of surprise on his face. Sam had fired from an upstairs window, his aim true. Chaos erupted. Josiah and the remaining brother opened fire, bullets splintering the hotel's wooden facade. Kieran dove for cover, returning fire from behind a porch column. More shots came from the hotel, Jack from the roof, Nate from a ground floor window. "Get down," Martha ordered, pulling Eleanor away from the window just as a bullet shattered the glass. Eleanor clutched Michael, who had begun screaming at the noise. She huddled against the wall, trying to shield him with her body as the gunfight continued below. The shooting seemed to go on forever, though in reality it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. When it finally stopped, an eerie silence fell, broken only by Michael's frightened cries and the ringing in Eleanor's ears. "Stay here," Martha said, moving cautiously toward the door. "I'll see what's happened." "No," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "We'll go together." With Michael clutched tightly to her chest, Eleanor followed Martha into the hallway. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, and dust motes danced in the beams of light that streamed through bullet holes in the walls. They found Sam in the hallway, blood seeping from a graze on his arm but otherwise unharmed. "It's over," he told them, his voice grim. "Two of them are down. Josiah escaped, but he's wounded." Eleanor's heart clenched. "Kieran." Sam's expression softened slightly. "He's all right." Out front with Jack and Nate. Eleanor hurried downstairs, desperate to see for herself that Kieran had survived. She found him on the porch, directing Jack and Nate as they moved one of the fallen Blackwoods, the young one who'd fired first, into the hotel lobby. The man was clearly dead, his unseeing eyes staring at the ceiling. Kieran looked up as Eleanor appeared, relief washing over his face when he saw her and Michael unharmed. "You should go back upstairs," he said, crossing to her. "This isn't a sight for either of you. Is it over?" Eleanor asked, unable to tear her eyes from the dead outlaw. This man had been part of the gang that killed Thomas, that had threatened her and Michael. She should feel satisfaction at his death, or at least relief, but all she felt was a profound weariness. "Not entirely," Kieran replied, guiding her gently away from the body. "Josiah got away, though he's wounded. Nate and I will track him at first light." "And then?" Eleanor asked, meeting his eyes. "What happens after that?" Kieran's gaze softened as it moved from her face to Michael, who had quieted and was now watching the proceedings with wide, curious eyes. "That depends," he said quietly, "on what you want to happen." Before Eleanor could respond, Sheriff Parker burst through the door, his deputy behind him. "Heard the shooting," he said, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. "I see you handled it." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The sheriff took statements from everyone, arranged for the undertaker to collect the bodies of the two fallen Blackwoods, and organized a posse to search for Josiah. The town gradually emerged from behind locked doors, curious neighbors gathering to see what had happened. Through it all, Eleanor moved as if in a dream, caring for Michael, helping Martha tend to Sam's wound, preparing coffee for the men who came and went. It was well past midnight when the hotel finally emptied of everyone, except its regular occupants Eleanor, Michael, Martha, and Kieran and his men, who had been offered rooms for the night. "You should get some rest," Martha told Eleanor as they cleaned the kitchen. "It's been a long day and there'll be plenty to do tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, exhaustion suddenly washing over her. "What about you?" "I'll follow my own advice shortly," Martha replied with a tired smile. "Just want to finish up here first." Upstairs, Eleanor found Kieran waiting outside her door. He'd washed the gunpowder residue from his hands and face, but his clothes still bore the dust and dirt of the confrontation. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, his voice low so as not to wake the others. "Both of you." "We're fine," Eleanor assured him, adjusting a sleeping Michael in her arms. "Thanks to you and your friends." Kieran shook his head. "I put you in danger. If you hadn't come back, the Blackwoods would still have found me," Eleanor interrupted. "And I wouldn't have had warning or protection. You saved us, Kieran, again." He looked down, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's not over," he reminded her. "Josiah's still out there." "But he's wounded and alone," Eleanor pointed out, "and you'll find him tomorrow." Kieran nodded, his expression resolute. "First light. Nate's the best tracker I've ever known. Josiah won't get far." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Eleanor was acutely aware of how close they'd come to death, of how fragile life was on this frontier. "When you find him," she said finally, "what then? Will you kill him?" Kieran considered her question seriously. "If he forces my hand, yes," he admitted. "But I'd rather bring him in alive." "Let the law deal with him." Something in his tone made Eleanor study his face more closely. "That's different from how you felt when we first met," she observed. "You were set on vengeance then." "I was," Kieran agreed. "For a long time, that's all I could see, making the Blackwoods pay for my brother's death." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "But somewhere along the way, that changed." "What happened?" Eleanor asked softly. Kieran's gaze moved to Michael, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I met a woman and her baby on the road to Laramie," he said, his voice gentle. "And I remembered there are things worth fighting for, not just against." The simple honesty of his words touched Eleanor deeply. This was a different man from the grim, vengeance-driven cowboy who had found her and Michael dying of thirst by the roadside. There was a peace in him now, despite the danger that still lurked. "You should get some sleep," Kieran said, stepping back. "Tomorrow will come early." "Kieran," Eleanor called softly as he turned to go. When he looked back, she continued, "When this is truly over, when Josiah is caught, what will you do then?" He studied her face in the dim light of the hallway. "That depends," he said, echoing his words from earlier. "On whether there's a reason for me to stay." The question hung unspoken between them, and Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. For months, she had been focused solely on survival, on building a safe life for Michael. She hadn't allowed herself to think beyond that, to consider the possibility of happiness, of love. But now, looking at Kieran, at the man who had saved them, who had returned to protect them, who looked at her son with such gentle regard, she felt something unfurl within her. Hope, perhaps. Or the courage to reach for something more than mere survival. "There could be," she said quietly, "a reason to stay." A slow smile spread across Kieran's face, transforming his weathered features. "Then I guess we'll have to talk again," he said, "when it's over." "I guess we will," Eleanor agreed, returning his smile. Kieran tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that had become familiar and dear to her. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Kieran," she replied, watching as he walked down the hallway to his own room. Inside her room, Eleanor gently laid Michael in his cradle, then moved to the window. The town was quiet now, the excitement of the gunfight having given way to the stillness of late night. Tomorrow, Kieran and Nate would ride out to track Josiah Blackwood. There would be more danger, more uncertainty. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Eleanor found herself looking toward the future with something other than fear. Whatever happened tomorrow, she was no longer alone. She had Martha. She had the beginnings of a community here in Sweetwater, and perhaps she had Kieran if he chose to stay, if she chose to let him in. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor's gaze fell on the wooden horse Kieran had carved for Michael. She picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth surface, remembering how he had said it was so the boy would remember. But remember what? The danger they had faced, the cowboy who had saved them. Or perhaps it was to remember that even in the harshest landscape, beauty and kindness could still be found. That after loss, there could be renewal. That a journey begun in desperation could end in hope. Eleanor placed the carving back on the shelf and climbed into bed, suddenly eager for morning to come. For the first time in a long time, she found herself looking forward to what the future might hold. Morning dawned clear and cold, the first true hint of winter in the air. Eleanor woke early before Michael stirred and dressed quickly. She found Martha already in the kitchen, brewing coffee and mixing biscuit dough. "Couldn't sleep?" the older woman asked, noting Eleanor's early appearance. "Not well," Eleanor admitted, taking a cup of coffee gratefully. "Too much on my mind." Martha nodded understandingly. "The men are already up. Kieran and Nate left at first light to track Blackwood. Jack and Sam are keeping watch, in case Josiah circled back with reinforcements." Eleanor's heart sank slightly at the news that Kieran had already gone. She'd hoped to see him before he left, to wish him safe hunting, to remind him of their unfinished conversation. "He left this for you," Martha added, reaching into her apron pocket and withdrawing a folded piece of paper. "Asked me to give it to you when you came down." Eleanor took the note with slightly trembling fingers and moved to the window to read it by the early morning light. "Eleanor," it read in a strong, slightly uneven hand. "Gone to finish what I started. When I return, we'll have that talk. Take care of Michael. I'll be back before sunset. Kieran." Simple and direct, like the man himself. Eleanor folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket, a small smile playing at her lips. "Good news?" Martha asked, observing her expression. "Just a promise," Eleanor replied. "To return." The day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor kept herself busy helping Martha clean up the damage from the previous night's gunfight, sweeping up broken glass, patching bullet holes in the walls, scrubbing bloodstains from the porch boards. Michael was fussy, perhaps sensing her tension, and required constant attention. By mid-afternoon, there was still no sign of Kieran and Nate. Jack and Sam remained vigilant, though they assured Eleanor that the delay wasn't unusual. "Tracking takes time," Jack explained as they sat at the kitchen table, cleaning their weapons. "Especially if Josiah's trying to cover his trail." "And he would be. Nate's the best there is," Sam added. "If anyone can find Blackwood, it's him." Their confidence should have reassured Eleanor, but as the afternoon waned and the shadows lengthened, worry gnawed at her. What if Josiah had laid a trap? What if Kieran was lying injured somewhere? Or worse, she was in the hotel lobby, straightening furniture that had been moved during the fight, when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Looking out the window, she saw 3 riders approaching Kieran, Nate, and between them, a slumped figure on a horse, his hands bound to the saddle horn. Josiah Blackwood. Relief washed over Eleanor in a dizzying wave. They'd done it. Kieran had kept his word both to bring Josiah to justice and to return before sunset. She hurried outside, reaching the porch just as the men dismounted. Josiah looked far less imposing than he had the previous evening. His face was pale, blood staining his shirt where a bullet had grazed his side. His eyes, when they met Eleanor's, held none of the arrogance she'd seen before. There was only defeat and perhaps a flicker of recognition. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, his voice rough. "So it was you after all." Eleanor stood straighter, refusing to be intimidated. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, it was me." Kieran moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "He won't trouble you again," he said quietly. "Or anyone else. The judge in Cheyenne will see to that." Sheriff Parker arrived moments later, summoned by one of the townspeople who had spotted the returning party. He took charge of Josiah, leading him away to the small jailhouse where he would await transfer to Cheyenne for trial. As the sheriff led Josiah away, the outlaw looked back once, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. "Your husband," he said suddenly. "He died brave. Wouldn't give up his cattle without a fight, if that matters to you." Eleanor felt Kieran tense beside her, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "It matters," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for telling me." It wasn't forgiveness. She could never forgive the man who had taken Thomas from her and Michael, but it was an acknowledgement. A closing of one chapter so that another could begin. After Josiah was taken away, the tension that had gripped the town for the past day began to dissipate. Martha announced that the hotel would reopen the following morning, and Jack and Sam made plans to depart, having fulfilled their purpose in coming to Sweetwater. "What about you?" Eleanor asked Nate as they sat around the kitchen table that evening, sharing a meal that Martha had insisted on preparing to celebrate their victory. "Will you be leaving too?" Nate glanced at Kieran before answering. "Got business in Denver," he said, "but I reckon I can delay a day or two. Never hurts to rest up before a long ride." The conversation flowed easily after that, the men sharing stories from their travels, Martha contributing tales from the hotel's early days. Eleanor listened, content to be part of this makeshift family, this moment of peace after so much turmoil. As the evening wore on, the others gradually excused themselves, Martha to check the hotel ledger, Jack and Sam to have a celebratory drink at the newly reopened saloon, Nate to see to the horses. Eventually, only Eleanor and Kieran remained, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. "You kept your word," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Both of them." Kieran looked puzzled. "Both. You brought Josiah to justice," Eleanor explained, "and you came back before sunset, just like your note said you would." A smile touched Kieran's lips. "I try to be a man of my word," he said, "especially when it matters." "And does it?" Eleanor asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Matter?" Kieran's eyes met hers, serious and intent. "You know it does," he said quietly. "You and Michael, you matter more than I expected, more than I was prepared for when I found you on that road." Eleanor's breath caught at the simple honesty in his words. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now that the Blackwoods are dealt with, now that your brother is avenged?" Kieran was silent for a moment, considering her question. "For a long time," he finally said, "vengeance was all I could see, all I wanted. It consumed me, defined me." He looked down at his hands, strong and capable, on the table, but somewhere along the way that changed. "I started to remember who I was before the man who dreamed of his own ranch, of building something that would last. And now," Eleanor prompted when he fell silent again. "Now I'm wondering if those dreams might still be possible," he said, meeting her eyes again. "If there might be room in them for more than just cattle and land." Eleanor's heart raced at the implication in his words. "I think," she said carefully, "that the best dreams have room for growth. For change. Kieran reached across the table, his hand covering hers. I'm not asking for promises, Eleanor. It's too soon for that, I know. You've lost too much, and we barely know each other. Don't we? Eleanor interrupted, turning her hand to interlace her fingers with his. I know you're a man who would ride for days to warn a woman and child he barely knows. Who would risk his life to protect them. Who looks at a baby that isn't his with kindness in his eyes. A faint color touched Kieran's cheeks at her words. And I know you're a woman of extraordinary courage, he replied. Who walked away from her home to save her child. Who rebuilt her life from nothing. Who can look the man who widowed her in the eye without flinching. Their eyes held, understanding passing between them. They had known each other for only a short time, yet in some ways, they knew each other better than people who had spent years together. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable, their most determined. They had faced death side by side. I'm not asking for promises either, Eleanor said softly, but I am asking you to stay, for a while at least, to see if what's growing between us is something worth nurturing. Kieran's hand tightened on hers. I'll stay, he said simply, for as long as you want me to. The promise hung in the air between them, both less and more than a declaration of love. It was a beginning, a recognition of possibility, a willingness to see what might develop between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. A cry from upstairs broke the moment Michael, waking from his evening nap. Eleanor smiled ruefully. Duty calls, she said, rising from her chair. Kieran stood as well. May I come with you? He asked. I'd like to say good night to him. Together they climbed the stairs to Eleanor's room, where Michael was indeed awake and making his displeasure known. Eleanor lifted him from his cradle, soothing him with gentle words. Someone's hungry, she observed as Michael nuzzled against her, seeking nourishment. Kieran moved toward the door. I'll leave you to it, he said, understanding her need for privacy. Wait, Eleanor called as he reached for the doorknob. When he turned back, she asked, would you mind holding him first? Just for a moment. Something like wonder crossed Kieran's face as she placed Michael in his arms. The baby immediately quieted, looking up at Kieran with curious eyes. Hello, little man, Kieran said softly. You've had quite an adventure, haven't you? Michael reached up, his tiny hand grasping at Kieran's chin. The simple gesture seemed to affect Kieran deeply. His eyes grew suspiciously bright as he gently bounced the baby in his arms. He likes you, Eleanor observed, her heart full at the sight of them together. Smart boy, Kieran replied, a smile breaking across his face. Takes after his mother. The moment stretched between them, full of promise and possibility. Eleanor knew there would be challenges, ahead grief didn't disappear overnight, and building a new life together would take time and patience. But watching Kieran with Michael, seeing the tenderness in his eyes, she felt certain that they were on the right path. Good night, Michael, Kieran said, carefully handing the baby back to Eleanor. Sleep well. As he turned to go, Eleanor caught his hand. Kieran, she said softly. When he looked at her questioningly, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Thank you for everything. Kieran's hand came up to cup her face, his touch light as a whisper. No need for thanks between us, he murmured. Not anymore. With that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Eleanor stood for a moment, Michael in her arms, her cheek still warm from Kieran's touch. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future didn't seem like a burden to be endured but a gift to be embraced. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Kieran stayed in Sweetwater, taking a room at the hotel while he explored what the town had to offer. He found work helping the local ranchers, his experience with cattle making him a valuable hand. In the evenings, he returned to the hotel, sharing meals with Eleanor, Martha, and occasionally Nate, who had extended his stay. Eleanor continued her work at the hotel, learning more about the business from Martha, who seemed increasingly pleased with her protégé. Michael thrived, growing stronger each day, beginning to show more of his personality, curious, determined, quick to smile. As November deepened toward winter, the first heavy snow fell, transforming Sweetwater into a picture from a Christmas card. The hotel filled with travelers seeking shelter from the weather, keeping Eleanor and Martha busy from dawn until well after dusk. Kieran often helped, carrying luggage, stoking fires, making repairs to the building. He moved through the hotel with increasing comfort, as if finding his place there among the guests and staff. One evening, about 2 weeks after the confrontation with the Blackwoods, Martha called Eleanor and Kieran into her office after dinner. Her expression was serious but not somber as she gestured for them to sit. "I've been thinking," she began without preamble. "I'm not getting any younger, and this hotel takes more energy each year to run properly." Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with Kieran. "Are you unwell, Martha?" she asked, concerned for the older woman who had become so important to her. Martha waved away the question. "Healthy as a horse, thank the Lord. But I'm 65 years old and I've been running this place for 15 years on my own. It's time I considered the future." She leaned forward, her gaze moving between Eleanor and Kieran. "I'm offering you a partnership in the hotel," she said directly. "Both of you. Eleanor, you've taken to the business like you were born to it, and Kieran, you've proven yourself handy with repairs and good with the guests." Stunned silence met her words. Eleanor was the first to recover. "Martha, that's incredibly generous, but it's not charity," Martha interrupted firmly. "It's good business sense. I need help and you two need a future. The way I see it, you could work with me for a few years, learn every aspect of running the place. Eventually, when I'm ready to retire completely, you could buy my share." Kieran cleared his throat. "It's a remarkable offer, Mrs. Atkins," he said. "But I should tell you, I've been considering purchasing land outside of town, starting a small ranch like I'd planned before." He trailed off, but Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying. Before his brother was killed, before vengeance consumed his life, before everything changed, Martha nodded, unsurprised. "I thought as much. And there's no reason you couldn't do both, help here at the hotel and develop your ranch. Plenty of men in these parts have multiple interests." She looked at Eleanor. "And you, my dear, what do you think?" Eleanor's mind was racing. A partnership in the hotel would provide security for her and Michael, a home, a purpose. And working alongside Kieran, that possibility made her heart beat faster. "I'm honored," she said finally, "and grateful, but I'd need to discuss it with Kieran first." Martha smiled, seemingly pleased by this response. "Of course. Take your time, talk it over. The offer stands." She rose, signaling the end of the meeting. "Now, if you'll excuse me, these old bones need rest." After Martha left, Eleanor and Kieran sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the unexpected proposition. "A ranch and a hotel," Eleanor said finally, a smile tugging at her lips. "That's quite an empire you're being offered, Mr. Xavier." Kieran's eyes met hers, serious despite her teasing tone. "It's not the ranch or the hotel that interests me most," he said quietly. "It's the people I'd be sharing them with." The simple honesty of his words took Eleanor's breath away. Over the past 2 weeks, their relationship had deepened, growing from tentative friendship to something more profound. They had shared stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. They had grown comfortable in each other's company, finding in their differences complementary strengths. But until now, neither had spoken so directly about what was developing between them. "Kieran," Eleanor began, then faltered, uncertain how to express the tangle of emotions she felt: gratitude, affection, hope, and yes, the beginnings of love. You don't have to say anything, Kieran assured her, reaching across the desk to take her hand. I know it's soon. Too soon, maybe, but I want you to know where I stand. Whatever we decide about Martha's offer, my feelings for you and Michael won't change. Eleanor turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. It's not too soon, she said softly. Not when you consider all we've been through together. Time moves differently out here on the frontier. We measure it in experiences, not days or months. A smile spread across Kieran's face, transforming his features. In that moment, Eleanor saw glimpses of the man he must have been before grief had etched permanent lines around his eyes, younger, more carefree, full of dreams. Then maybe, he suggested, we should accept Martha's offer. Build something together, the hotel, the ranch. A future. A future, Eleanor repeated, the word tasting sweet on her tongue. I'd like that. Later that evening, as snow fell softly outside the window, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair in her room, nursing Michael before bed. The baby was nearly asleep, his eyelids drooping as he suckled. Her mind was still full of the conversation with Kieran. A partnership not just in business but in life. It wasn't a formal proposal, not yet, but the intention was clear in his eyes, in the gentle way he spoke of the future. Eleanor had never expected to find love again after Thomas died. Had never thought her heart, shattered by grief, could reassemble itself around a new relationship. Yet here she was, contemplating a life with Kieran Xavier, the quiet cowboy who had lifted her and Michael from the dust of the trail and carried them to safety. Life was strange, she reflected, full of unexpected turns and second chances. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow fleeing for her life. Now she was being offered a partnership in a thriving business, the affection of a good man, a community that had embraced her and Michael. The difference was stark, almost miraculous. Yet Eleanor knew it wasn't a miracle, but the result of courage, hers in setting out to save her child, Kieran's in confronting his demons, Martha's in opening her home and business to strangers. Courage and the willingness to begin again after loss. As Michael finally drifted to sleep, Eleanor gently detached him and placed him in his cradle. She tucked the blanket around him, marveling as always at his perfect, tiny features, his complete trust as he slept. "Sleep well, my love," she whispered. "Tomorrow is a new day." And what a tomorrow it promised to be, the first of many in a new life, unexpected but welcome, built from the ashes of what had been lost. A soft knock at the door pulled Eleanor from her reverie. She opened it to find Kieran standing there, a hesitant expression on his face. "I know it's late," he said, "but I wanted to ask you something." Eleanor opened the door wider, inviting him in. "Michael's just fallen asleep," she warned in a whisper. Kieran nodded, moving quietly into the room. His gaze went immediately to the cradle, a soft expression crossing his face as he looked at the sleeping baby. "He's growing so fast," he observed. "Soon he'll be running around, getting into everything." "Don't remind me," Eleanor said with a smile. "I'm enjoying these quiet days while they last." They stood side by side, watching Michael sleep, the silence between them comfortable and companionable. Finally, Kieran turned to her. "I've been thinking about Martha's offer," he said, "and about us." Eleanor's heart quickened at his serious tone. "And?" "I meant what I said earlier," Kieran continued, "about building a future together, but I want to do it right." He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Eleanor, I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you and Michael. I want to be a family if you'll have me." The simple declaration, spoken without flourish but with complete sincerity, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Oh, Kieran," she whispered. "Yes, yes, we'll have you." He gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, almost reverent, then deepening into something more passionate as she responded to him. "I love you," Eleanor said when they finally parted, the words coming easily, naturally. "I didn't expect to, didn't think I could again after Thomas, but I do." Kieran's smile was radiant in the dim lamplight. "Then we'll tell Martha tomorrow that we accept her offer," he said. "And we'll ask the Reverend if he's free to perform a wedding before Christmas." "Christmas," Eleanor repeated, warmth spreading through her at the thought of becoming Kieran's wife so soon. "That gives us just over a month to prepare." "Too soon?" Kieran asked, suddenly uncertain. Eleanor shook her head, smiling up at him. "Not too soon, just right." As if in agreement, Michael stirred in his cradle, making the soft sounds that preceded waking. Eleanor moved to check on him, Kieran following close behind. "Someone wants to join the conversation," Eleanor said, lifting the baby. "What do you think, Michael? Should we marry Mr. Xavier before Christmas?" Michael blinked up at them, then broke into a gummy smile that seemed to light the entire room. Kieran laughed, the sound rich and joyful. "I'll take that as approval," he said, reaching out to stroke Michael's cheek with one gentle finger. As Eleanor watched Kieran with her son, she felt a sense of completeness, of rightness, settle over her. This was what she had been moving toward since that terrible day when she found Thomas's body not just survival, but renewal. A new family, different from the one she had lost, but no less precious. "Christmas it is," she agreed, leaning against Kieran's solid warmth as Michael drifted back to sleep in her arms. "A new beginning for all of us." The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a whirl of activity. Word of Eleanor and Kieran's engagement spread quickly through Sweetwater, met with general approval and more than a few knowing smiles from those who had observed their growing closeness. Martha threw herself into wedding preparations with surprising energy, insisting on hosting the ceremony and reception at the hotel. "It's not every day my partners get married," she declared, brushing aside their protests that a simple ceremony would suffice. Kieran, meanwhile, finalized the purchase of a small plot of land about a mile outside of town, not large enough for a proper ranch yet, but with room to grow as their fortunes improved. He began construction on a modest house, enlisting the help of several local men who were glad for the winter work. "It won't be ready by Christmas," he told Eleanor apologetically as they toured the partially framed structure one crisp December afternoon. "But by spring, we should be able to move in." "It's perfect," Eleanor assured him, envisioning the finished home, their home with curtains at the windows and Michael taking his first steps across the wooden floor. The wedding was set for December 23rd, just before Christmas. Eleanor, who had little money for a new dress, was surprised when Martha presented her with a package 2 weeks before the ceremony. "This was my daughter's," the older woman explained as Eleanor unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal a beautiful gown of ivory silk. "She never got to wear it. She died before her wedding day. I've kept it all these years, thinking someday it might bring joy instead of sorrow." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes at the unexpected gift. "Martha, I can't—" "You can and you will," Martha interrupted, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "She would have liked you, my Sarah, would have approved of seeing her dress worn by a bride who deserves happiness." The dress required only minor alterations, which Martha undertook herself, working late into the night to ensure every detail was perfect. Watching her bent over the delicate fabric, Eleanor felt a rush of affection for this strong, generous woman who had taken her in when she had nothing and was now helping her build a new life. 2 days before the wedding, an unexpected letter arrived for Kieran. The hotel's winter courier, who made the journey to Cheyenne once a month regardless of weather, delivered it along with the usual mail and supplies. Eleanor was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when Kieran found her, the open letter in his hand and an odd expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Bad news." "Not bad," Kieran replied slowly. "Just unexpected. It's from the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. Josiah Blackwood's trial is set for January. They want me to testify." Eleanor absorbed this information. "Will you go?" Kieran nodded. "I have to. My testimony, along with Nate's, is the strongest evidence against him for my brother's murder. Without it, he might only face charges for the gunfight here." "When would you leave?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. They had been planning to spend their first weeks as husband and wife at the hotel, working alongside Martha while Kieran finished their house. "After New Year's," Kieran said. "The trial begins on January 10th. I'd need to leave by the 3rd or 4th to ensure I arrive in time, given the winter conditions." He crossed the room to take her hands in his. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know it's not how we planned to start our marriage." Eleanor squeezed his hands reassuringly. "It's all right. This is important justice for your brother, for Thomas, for all the others the Blackwoods hurt. I understand." Kieran's expression softened. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Probably not," Eleanor agreed with a teasing smile. "But you're stuck with me anyway, Kieran Xavier." He laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Happily stuck," he murmured against her hair. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Eleanor woke early, a mixture of excitement and nerves fluttering in her stomach. Today she would become Kieran's wife, would formally begin the new chapter of her life that had been slowly taking shape since that dusty day on the road to Laramie. Martha insisted on helping her prepare, shooing Kieran away when he attempted to see Eleanor before the ceremony. "Bad luck," she declared firmly. "You'll see your bride at the altar, not before." With Martha's assistance, Eleanor dressed in the ivory silk gown, her hair arranged in a simple but elegant style adorned with a few sprigs of holly, the only flowers available in the depths of winter. Michael, now nearly a year old, was dressed in a new suit that Martha had ordered specially from Cheyenne. "You look beautiful," Martha said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Kieran won't know what hit him." Eleanor studied her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the poised, radiant woman who looked back at her. Was this really the same person who had fled her homestead in terror just months ago, her baby crying from hunger in her arms? The transformation wasn't just in her appearance but in her spirit. The grief that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death hadn't disappeared. She suspected it never would entirely, but it had changed, softened, made room for joy to exist alongside it. "Ready?" Martha asked, checking the clock. "The guests will be arriving soon." Eleanor nodded, gathering Michael into her arms. "Ready," she confirmed, and she had never meant anything more sincerely in her life. The hotel's dining room had been transformed for the occasion. Tables had been moved aside to create space for rows of chairs, borrowed from the church and various neighbors. At the far end, a simple altar had been arranged, decorated with pine branches and candles. The room was full. It seemed as if the entire town of Sweetwater had turned out for the event. Kieran stood at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in a new suit, his hair freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven. Beside him was Nate, serving as best man. The Reverend Johnson, Sweetwater's circuit preacher who had fortuitously been in town for the Christmas season, stood ready to perform the ceremony. As Eleanor entered the room, Michael in her arms and Martha at her side, a hush fell over the assembled guests. All eyes turned to her, but Eleanor saw only Kieran, whose expression of wonder and love made her heart swell. She walked slowly toward him, each step bringing her closer to her future. When she reached the altar, Martha took Michael, allowing Eleanor to join hands with Kieran. "You're breathtaking," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the joys and sorrows that life might bring. When Kieran slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, a simple gold band he had purchased from the mercantile, his hands were steady, his eyes certain. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Johnson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Kieran kissed her, sealing their union, Eleanor felt a sense of homecoming, of completion. This was where she belonged with this man, with their son, for Michael was truly theirs now, in this community that had embraced them. The reception that followed was joyful and boisterous. Martha had outdone herself with the refreshments: a wedding cake, punch, and enough food to feed the entire town twice over. Music was provided by the local schoolteacher on the piano and a rancher who played the fiddle with surprising skill. Eleanor and Kieran moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from their neighbors and friends. Michael, passed from person to person, reveled in the attention, his laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. "Mrs. Xavier," Kieran said, finding a moment alone with Eleanor as the celebration continued around them. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," Eleanor replied honestly. "As wonderful as it feels." As evening approached, the guests began to depart, returning to their homes through the snowy streets. Martha had arranged for Eleanor, Kieran, and Michael to stay in the hotel's best suite, usually reserved for wealthy travelers, for their wedding night. "Consider it my gift to you," she said, pressing the key into Eleanor's hand. "I'll mind the front desk and keep an eye on things. You three enjoy your first night as a family." The suite was beautifully appointed, with a large bed, a sitting area, and a separate small room where Michael's cradle had been placed. Candles had been lit, casting a warm glow over the space, and a bottle of champagne, a rare luxury in Sweetwater, waited on a small table. After settling Michael, who was exhausted from the excitement of the day, Kieran and Eleanor retreated to the main room. Kieran poured 2 glasses of champagne, handing one to Eleanor. "To us," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." "To us," Eleanor echoed, clinking her glass against his. They sat together on the small sofa, Kieran's arm around Eleanor's shoulders, enjoying the peaceful moment after the busy day. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, the flakes visible through the window, dancing in the light from the street lamps. "Are you happy?" Kieran asked, his voice soft in the quiet room. Eleanor looked up at him, at this man who had become her husband, her partner, her future. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she answered truthfully. "And you?" Kieran's eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "I came west looking for a new start," he said. "Never dreamed I'd find so much more." He set aside his glass and took hers, placing it on the table beside his own. Then, with infinite tenderness, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of love, of commitment, of a future stretching out before them filled with possibility. As the kiss deepened, Eleanor surrendered to the moment, to the joy of being in her husband's arms, of knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Later, as they lay entwined in the large bed, the candles burning low, Eleanor rested her head on Kieran's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. This man, who had once been a stranger, was now the center of her world along with Michael, sleeping peacefully in the next room. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking about the day we met," she said. How desperate I was, how certain that Michael and I would die there in the dust. And now? Kieran prompted, his voice gentle. Now I know that wasn't an ending but a beginning, Eleanor replied. The moment our lives changed course and started moving toward us. Kieran's arms tightened around her. I thank God every day for leading me to that road, he said. For giving me the chance to find you and Michael. Eleanor lifted her head to look into his eyes, visible even in the dim light. And I thank God for sending you to us, she whispered. My cowboy who lifted us from the dust and carried us home. Kieran smiled at her words, understanding their significance. Home, he repeated. That's what we've found, isn't it? Not just a place, but each other. Yes, Eleanor agreed, settling back against his chest. Home at last. As they drifted toward sleep, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey marked by loss and pain, but also by courage, kindness, and ultimately, love. The path ahead would have its own challenges, she knew, but they would face them together as a family. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Sweetwater in pure white, covering the old year's troubles and sorrows, making way for the new year's hopes and dreams. And in a warm room at the center of town, a new family slept peacefully, secure in each other's love, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening, Eleanor Xavier stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Kieran taught Michael how to ride his new pony. The boy, now 6 years old, sat proudly in the small saddle, his father's hand steady on the reins as they circled the corral. Look, Mama, Michael called, waving excitedly. I'm riding by myself. I see you, sweetheart, Eleanor called back, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. Beside her, 2-year-old Sarah toddled along the porch railing, her tiny hands gripping the wood as she practiced her walking. At Eleanor's feet, baby Thomas, just 6 months old, slept peacefully in his basket, undisturbed by his siblings' commotion. The years since her wedding to Kieran had been full and rich. True to their agreement with Martha, they had worked at the hotel while Kieran developed their ranch. Initially just a small homestead with a few cattle, the Xavier Ranch had grown steadily, now boasting a respectable herd and several fine horses. Martha still owned the hotel, though she had gradually reduced her role in its daily operations, allowing Eleanor to take over more of the management. These days, Eleanor divided her time between the ranch and the hotel, with Martha's help when the children needed minding. Their family had grown too. Sarah had been born 3 years after their wedding, a tiny replica of Eleanor with the same blonde hair and determined spirit. Thomas had followed this past winter, named for the father Michael had never known but whom Eleanor made sure he remembered through stories and the few mementos she had kept. Kieran had legally adopted Michael shortly after their wedding, though the boy knew the truth about his biological father. You have 2 fathers who love you, Eleanor had explained when Michael was old enough to understand. One who watches over you from heaven, and one who is here to guide you every day. The Blackwood gang was now just a distant memory. Josiah had been convicted and hanged for his crimes, the remaining members of the gang either dead or scattered to the winds. The nightmares that had once plagued both Eleanor and Kieran had faded, replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Kieran lifted Michael from the pony and set him on his shoulders for the walk back to the house. The boy giggled, holding onto his father's hat for balance. Supper ready? Kieran asked as they reached the porch, swinging Michael down to stand beside him. Almost, Eleanor replied, leaning in to receive the kiss Kieran offered. Martha sent bread from town and the stew's been simmering all afternoon. Sounds perfect, Kieran said, his eyes warm as they took in his family gathered on the porch, just like everything else. Later, after the children were asleep, Michael in his own room, Sarah and Thomas in the nursery, Eleanor and Kieran sat on the porch swing, enjoying the cool evening air and the rare moment of quiet. "I had a letter from Jack today," Kieran said, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "He's finally settling down, marrying a widow from Denver next month." Eleanor smiled at the news. "Good for him. Will they stay in Denver?" "No, moving to Wyoming," Kieran replied. "He asked if there might be work around here." "There's always work for a good man," Eleanor said, knowing Kieran would find a place for his old friend. And Martha could use help at the hotel with the tourist season coming. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Eleanor marveled, as she often did, at the journey that had brought them here from that desperate day on the dusty road to this peaceful evening on their own land, surrounded by the family they had built together. "Penny for your thoughts," Kieran said, noticing her contemplative mood. Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was just thinking how blessed we are," she said. "How far we've come." Kieran's arm tightened around her. "We have come a long way," he agreed, "but the best part of the journey has been sharing it with you." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Eleanor felt a deep sense of contentment. The path had not always been easy, but it had led them here to a home filled with love, to a family bound by choice as much as by blood, to a future bright with promise. Her baby had cried from hunger in the dust, and the cowboy had lifted them into his arms and held them close. And in that moment, though she couldn't have known it then, their story had truly begun, a story of courage and kindness, of second chances and new beginnings, of a love strong enough to build a life upon, a love that had brought them home.